In what has to be one of the most reckless and perplexing decisions in military history, Japan decided to declare war on the Western allies while already struggling to sustain its economic and military efforts in a protracted conflict with China. What made them believe they could defeat the world's most powerful industrial power, the United States, as well as Britain's empire and other European colonial powers? Was it arrogance, desperation, or a simple miscalculation that drove Japan into a war it had little chance of winning? Life in Japan during the 1930s was a blend of both traditional Japanese medieval culture and modern Western ideas. The Tenjin Matsuri Festival, seen here at Osaka in 1937, was held to appease the spirit of the thunder god Tenjin. It exemplifies the people's desire to remember their ancient culture during a time of rapid industrialization and cultural transformation. Japan had barely emerged from the widespread poverty and famine caused by the Great Depression at the time this was shot. Like many other countries, Japan's economic growth was severely hampered by the Great Depression, which led to a decline in exports, a sharp increase in unemployment, and starvation in many rural areas. This hardship led to political extremism, as it had in many other countries in Europe. Amid this economic turmoil, the military emerged as a dominant force. They asserted that only they could secure Japan's prosperity by carrying out a plan for economic growth that involved using force to seize natural resources, consolidating Japan's position as a major global power. The government of Japan became heavily influenced by military factions and ultranationalists by the early 1930s. Often, violence was used to silence political opponents. The assassination of Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi in 1932 gave militarists greater influence over Japanese politics, resulting in the gradual transition from civilian leadership to military domination. In order to fuel its rapid industrialization, Japan had to import raw materials like iron, rubber, and oil, primarily from the United States, as its economy expanded in the early 1930s. The Japanese believed that by gaining resource-rich territories, they would be able to become economically independent and self-sufficient, which would strengthen their economy and pull them out of the Great Depression. Japan thus turned its attention to East Asia, particularly Manchuria, which possessed a wealth of resources that it needed to sustain its economic growth. In 1931, without consulting the civilian government in Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Army conquered Manchuria with little resistance. With its abundance of natural resources and labor force, Army-owned companies transformed Manchuria into a reliable source of material support for the Japanese Army. After being criticized for its actions in Manchuria, Japan left the League of Nations in 1933, signaling its rejection of international diplomacy. Rapid industrial expansion transformed the Japanese empire into a major manufacturing and industrial powerhouse, increasing its dependence on imported raw materials due to a critical shortage of natural resources on its home islands. Urban centers like Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama experienced significant industrial growth. Factories producing textiles, machinery, and chemicals became prominent, fueling Japan's economy. Cities underwent modernization with the construction of railways, tram systems, bridges, and paved roads. Electrification was spreading, and public utilities like water and sewage systems improved urban living conditions. The rise of factories and offices provided employment opportunities, drawing rural populations to cities in search of better prospects. The cityscape featured bustling markets, movie theaters, and department stores, which became symbols of modern consumerism. The middle class grew, leading to a more diverse urban population. Western-style clothing, jazz music, and dances like the Charleston gained popularity, particularly among the youth. Women began entering the workforce, especially in textile factories and as office workers. The contrast between old and new sparked debates about identity and values. The rise of the moga, Japanese for modern girl with her bobbed hair and Western dresses, symbolized the embracing of the modern era and freedom to some, but highlighted the moral decline of traditional values to others. Aware of the Soviet Union's growing power along the northern border of its newly conquered land, Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany in 1936 in an effort to challenge Soviet authority in the area. The emperor's younger brother, Prince Chichibu, travels to Europe the following year, paying a visit to Japan's newest ally, Nazi Germany. His gracious host treats him with the pomp and ceremony of a high-ranking official and invites him to the Nuremberg rally to meet the Führer, Adolf Hitler. In July 1937, Japan invaded China proper, starting a war that united once sworn enemies. Communist and nationalist forces collaborated to drive the invading army back. The nationalist capital of Nanjing was overrun by Japanese forces in December, which led to the Nanjing Massacre, in which tens of thousands of people associated with the defense of the garrison were killed. It is estimated that Japanese troops executed up to 250,000 civilians in mass executions. Government censorship ensures that Japanese citizens back home are unaware of the horrors carried out by its army in Nanjing. A national celebration is held to commemorate the fall of the Chinese capital, which the general public attends unaware of the brutality inflicted on the Chinese people by its troops. As the fighting in China intensifies, the Japanese government is forced to mobilize hundreds of thousands of men to meet the increasing demands of the conflict. The government in Tokyo assures them that they will be back home in less than a year. Little do they know that the conflict will last 8 years, ending only when Japan surrenders in 1945. The Japanese army made good progress in the first 2 years of conflict, advancing deep into Chinese territory and inflicting severe casualties on Chinese troops. However, the further into the hinterland the Japanese advanced, the further their lines of communication stretched, causing dire supply issues that eventually resulted in a stalemate on the front lines. With the promise of a quick victory evaporating, more and more men are called up to fight in the never-ending brutal conflict. Like so many other conscripted men before him, Nokichi Hakita marries his fiancée before going off to war. As he leaves for the front, he learns that she is pregnant. While the families come together to bless and wish the couple luck, no one is certain that the newlyweds will ever meet again. More than 1 million soldiers will not return home from overseas by war's end. In 1939, Japanese forces clashed with Russian troops over a border dispute, which escalated into a full-fledged offensive in the Soviet Far East. Ultimately, a Soviet force under the command of Georgy Zhukov, a little-known general at the time, defeated the Japanese army in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. This led to the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact being signed. This prompted the Japanese to abandon any future attempts to expand to the north, ensuring that any subsequent hostilities would be directed southward. The Tripartite Pact, a defensive military alliance, was signed by Japan, Germany, and Italy in Berlin in September 1940. Germany and Italy recognized Japan's right to establish a new East Asian order. In practice, however, the pact had little impact because the Japanese and Italian-German operational theaters were on different sides of the globe. When Japan occupied French Indochina on September 22, 1940, primarily to cut off Western supplies flowing into China, the U.S. government, which had been angered by Japan's aggression in China for years, finally lost patience and imposed crippling sanctions and an oil embargo. They declared that the embargo would remain in effect until Japan withdrew from China and ended its expansionist policies. The Japanese economy, already straining to meet the demands of the war with China, could not function without these resources. Because more than 93% of Japan's oil came from the United States, the oil embargo was particularly damaging. The Japanese government projected that if the embargo remained in place, the economy would collapse within 2 years. Negotiations to reach an agreement were conducted between the United States and Japan in the summer of 1941. When the U.S. rejected Japan's final offer, there seemed little they could do but withdraw from China. As Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe saw it, their failure in China seemed to rule out expanding the war to attack the United States, the British Empire, and their allies. Konoe was replaced as prime minister by General Hideki Tojo, who was appointed by Emperor Hirohito on October 18, 1941. Tojo had convinced the emperor that his strategy would secure Japan's victory over the Western Allies. His strategy was based on the concept of a short, limited war. The plan was to quickly seize resource-rich territories in the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, thereby making Japan economically self-sufficient. In order to buy time to consolidate its territorial gains and fortify newly seized islands scattered across the Pacific, Japan planned to attack Pearl Harbor in advance in the hopes of neutralizing the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single devastating blow. They hoped to use their position of strength to force the Western Allies to negotiate a peace treaty that would benefit Japan. Tojo predicted that, like the other European colonial powers, Britain would soon sue for peace with Germany. He believed the United States lacked the will to fight a long and costly war in the Pacific.
It is now obvious that England is losing the war. We cannot win this war for England regardless of how much assistance we send. That is why the America First Committee has been formed.
For years, Britain had pleaded with the United States to come to its aid against Nazi Germany, but American public opinion was firmly opposed.
Let Europe fight her own battles. They mean nothing to us.
He therefore estimated that after the American people experienced the economic hardship and significant death toll that war would bring, they would pressure their government to pursue peace. Japan's leadership was well aware of the United States' massive industrial output, but they believed that their superior fighting spirit and war experience could overcome their opponent's material advantages, as it had done against another superpower, Russia, 3 decades earlier in the Russo-Japanese War. Japan exceeded its wildest expectations in achieving its objectives during the first 6 months of the war, but they discovered that while it was their prerogative to start the war, it was not theirs to end it. The trouble was that with the United States' vast numerical advantage, there was no incentive for them to accept the status quo. With their vast manufacturing capabilities, the United States knew that the longer the war lasted, the stronger they became. Japan had underestimated the American fighting spirit and simply lacked the capacity to sustain a prolonged conflict against a country with twice the economic output of the entire Axis powers. By 1945, Japan was not only overwhelmingly outnumbered, but also far behind in terms of technology and cryptography, making their defeat all but certain.
If you liked this video, there are many similar high-quality videos on my channel.